July the 11th, 1963, Jackson County, Oregon. A suspicious bundle is found by a local fisherman in Keene Creek Reservoir.
He was out fishing in a portion of the reservoir that had a lower or decreased water level.
And he noticed a bundle on the side of the reservoir out of the water.
It looked odd to him, and it was just like a blanket and wrapped in some wires.
When the fisherman opened up the blankets, he got the shock of his life.
Right away, knew there was something wrong and went to local law enforcement and reported it, and that was when they found this concealed body of a young child.
An investigation is launched to track down the boy's family and to try and find out what happened to him.
Somebody had taken this child and thrown it into the reservoir, keeping it underneath the water so it wouldn't be discovered, wrapping it in wire and weights.
Baby boy Doe.
Name known only to God.
Police eventually run out of leads, and in time, the case goes cold.
Probably reached its cold status right about 1965.
But investigators never give up, and advances in DNA technology eventually provide them with the tool that will make the difference in the case. This is the story of baby boy Doe, also known as the boy in a bundle, whose identity remained unknown for nearly 60 years until he was finally identified through the science of genetic genealogy.
This can be done. We've found his name, and we've got an identity of this little toddler that has been unknown for over 50 years.
Summer 1963, Jackson County, Oregon. A local man is out fishing with friends at Keene Creek Reservoir when he notices a suspicious bundle lying half submerged in the water.
It was just a little bit north of where the dam for this creek was being placed. And there was about 15 inches of water.
This reservoir is very isolated. It's up in the rugged mountains. You have to take a very twisting road to get up there.
The fisherman who was out with his family, he ended up snagging and bringing up this bundle.
When he reeled it in and he looked at it and he opened it up, the shock of his life, there was a baby, a child.
This little body was discovered wrapped in blankets and then wrapped in a homemade quilt. It was also bound with wire and then weighted down with some weights.
He alerted the Oregon State Police, I believe through a local fire resource in that area. The Oregon State Police took an initial statement from him and notified the Jackson County Sheriff's Office.
The bundle is removed from the reservoir and an autopsy is carefully performed.
He was taken to a funeral home for that examination, just based on facilities that were available at the time.
I've been told from other cases that when children are involved, it's just very quiet. Usually in the autopsy room, nobody really says anything except what they do have to say.
I think everyone in that room was probably horrified because as you're unwinding this wire, you see this homemade quilt, which is just such a personal object. And you unfold that, and there's another blanket. And you unfold that, and then there's this child, probably quite unrecognizable at that point based on how long he'd been there.
There was an aqua blanket, there was a patchwork quilt, there were many windings of wire, different kinds of wire to hold the bundle together, and inside the bundle were some iron molds used in mining to weight the body down.
They could find no damage to the child's skull. They could find no broken bones in the child's body. There was no indication that the child had been hit or there was some kind of injury, left marks on the body.
He was wearing some little trainer shoes. He was wearing corduroy pants. He had a red and white striped shirt on, and they were good quality clothes, so it made them think that the little boy didn't come from perhaps like an impoverished family or a transient family. He seemed to be well cared for.
Investigators now try to establish the identity of the little boy with every tool at their disposal.
At the autopsy, they couldn't determine who he was. There was no missing child in the area that matched his description.
Anytime you discover remains that are disposed of in a non-traditional means, there's always an element of suspicion there.
They thought he might have died of natural causes, and then a parent disposed of him in this way. Of course, there's the possibility that he died in an accident or was murdered, and then he was hidden away.
Investigators were able to take footprints, and they sent those to the FBI, and the FBI was able to check the hospitals all over the country for those matching footprints.
If you could get that footprint and compare it to the birth certificate footprint, you might be able to get a match.
Investigators believe the child might have been from the local area.
A lot of what they were doing was really, what I'd refer to as boots on the ground work. They're looking for witnesses, they're trying to identify any of the clothing.
I would imagine that the community was horrified about the fact that a little boy was found in such a way in this reservoir that they all knew, and it was their area.
All the residents had to be interviewed. What did they know? Had they seen anything? Had they heard anything? Were they aware that a child was missing? They would put out flyers, literally posting them on a tree so that people would be aware that there was a child who had been found.
The police were able to make some progress in identifying the origin of some of the clothing.
They did discover that some of the clothing came from JCPenney. They talked to shoe store owners and found out about the shoes that the little boy was wearing, but unfortunately that style of shoe was sold up and down the West Coast. So again, not something that they could use to help pinpoint exactly where did this child come from and who might have bought the shoes.
The clothing that he was wearing would have been considered more high-end clothing for the time, so being in a rural area, not a lot of people would have access to clothing like that.
The team also tried to find out more about the weights which had held down the body.
They were 4 pounds each, and they were used to weigh the body down in the reservoir.
Investigators put an enormous amount of time into trying to figure out where did these molds come from, and they were so thorough in their investigation, talking to so many people in the mining industry, that they found the exact type of mold listed in a catalog, and it cost $1.25. They knew the exact model of the mold.
The police took these iron objects to the mining companies around Oregon and around Medford. Nothing.
These molds would have been throughout Southern Oregon and Northern California in the mining industry, so despite all that work, it was somewhat of a dead end because they discovered that they were just too common to really trace to any specific person.
The community soon provides leads on suspected family members who might have been involved in the disappearance of baby boy Doe.
There were some people who said there was a family living inside an abandoned mine shaft that they had converted into living quarters. And people said that they sold their children and gave away their children. So investigators tried to track them down, but by then the family had moved out of the mine shaft. They talked to a welfare worker who said that they had one little boy and then another little boy had died or perhaps was missing. Finally, they discovered that the woman had in fact given birth to twins, but it was in Salem General Hospital, not in the area. One of the twins was stillborn, and the other twin didn't even survive and leave the hospital. So the family did in fact have a tragedy of 2 children who died, but they were not guilty of killing one of their children and bundling him up and putting him in a reservoir.
I think a lot of people would think about it as if this was my child or if this was a child that I was involved in their life, you know, this would not be what I would want for my family or what I would like to see for my family, not what I want in my community.
Police meticulously pursue every lead they receive and even get assistance from the highest office of law enforcement in the land.
There was a letter signed by J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI in Washington, D.C., where he was sending out requests to police agencies for information.
With such widespread public interest in the case, investigators are confident they will soon discover the true identity of baby boy Doe.
I think initially they believed it was going to be a local child.
Neighbors became very suspicious of neighbors. People became very suspicious of other people.
At a certain point, they were working any missing children leads for that time frame.
But despite extensive efforts by investigators, the case begins to go cold.
All the tips that they received, they accounted for all the children that were known to those people or associated with those people.
There were several people who looked like there was a lead in this case, and they all turned out to be a blind alley. They went nowhere.
This could have been somebody either passing through the area or had knowledge of the area that just happened to choose the area based on its rural location.
And then all of a sudden it just goes cold and no one's working the case. And then you look at the date and that was during the time of the Kennedy assassination, and it was all efforts on that.
The materials were put away in a box and then not discovered until later when they decided again to do another sweep for cold cases. The community and the investigators did organize a burial for the child.
He was buried at Hillcrest Memorial Cemetery, baby boy Doe.
Name known only to God.
Then, in 2008, the case is reopened by the Sheriff's Department.
Detective Colin Fagan had found some boxes full of old files, and he asked an investigator named Jim Tattersall to look through those. And Jim Tattersall found this case of the King Creek boy, as they called it at the time, and said, here's one where it's the body of a small child that was discovered in King Creek Reservoir, and nobody has been able to find the identity yet.
They decided to exhume the child's body and extract DNA.
It looked like a crime, and while maybe there was some innocent explanation, the affidavit that they submitted to the judge said, this appears to be a crime. It is probable cause to issue a warrant for the exhumation of the body.
They went to the cemetery. They made a scheduled appointment with all of the investigators that were on the case at that point. The medical examiner was there, and they simply knew exactly what plot he was in. They took all of the dirt away, got his casket out, and then proceeded to do a second examination on him.
Would the remains of baby boy Doe be preserved in a good enough condition to allow investigators to extract a DNA sample for further testing?
This body was placed in an embalmed situation where once you open that casket, it should be well preserved. This body had deteriorated.
Despite this, the police and the medical team were able to undertake an examination.
We were able to re-examine the skeleton. We were able to apply new resources to it. Forensic anthropologists took part in that, who are experts in bone development, congenital defects, body structure, body composition.
there was a sample that was taken from his upper thigh bone, and that was sent to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. And they provided DNA analysis and processing to us, and they created or concluded with a DNA profile from him.
The next step was to try to find a match.
His entire DNA profile was uploaded into the National DNA system and began to search against missing people, and there was never an association at that point.
DNA wasn't as widely used, so a lot of DNA databases in the country were basically just databases of criminals.
Investigators receive assistance from an unlikely source in the community.
2 local dentists had a new 360-degree imaging machine, so they took the child's skull there, and also with the help of an anthropologist who helped rebuild the skull, they were able to reconstruct the skull and get good images of that.
Anthropologists will usually reconstruct faces just for a visual examination and a visual cue to try and determine really what this child looked like.
The dentist said that there were some facial characteristics with the skull that were consistent with Down syndrome. And so at that time, that became another source of information in the case.
Now, for the first time, investigators can put a face to baby boy Doe.
They provided this 3-dimensional illustration or composite, if you will, of this little guy's facial features, and it was something that we had never had before. This composite of this little toddler is so personal, and you can see that he was a little person, he was a little guy. It makes it hit home quite a bit more to see his face and to see his facial characteristics.
Undeterred by the unsuccessful search in CODIS, investigators used the new image of baby boy Doe to renew their appeal for new information on the case.
Time kind of works in our favor in that people that may have known something at the time didn't want to say anything, didn't want to be involved. Typically those reservations will go away and we'll get more information from them. So this was an effort to solicit more of that information and maybe give folks something tangible to look at.
That went on a national basis out to law enforcement agencies and through the media.
It was a black and white image. It didn't have really any defining characteristics other than structure. When folks think of other people, familiar people, loved ones, typically they'll say, oh, he had brown hair, he had blonde hair. It was really distinct because it was white, or he had green eyes.
Undeterred by the unsuccessful search in CODIS, investigators used the new image of baby boy Doe to renew their appeal for new information on the case.
We had so many different points of information, but none of them were connecting. And so we just needed a push. We needed something to give us a little bit more information. There were tips that were coming in about who this little guy could potentially be. None of them were leading anywhere. And so I think it was very frustrating to the detectives that were working on it at that point, just as it had been extremely frustrating to those detectives who had worked on it in 1963.
Certain physical features now lead investigators to believe he may have suffered from a congenital birth defect.
This child's head was flattened, not a traumatic injury, but just an ordinary flattening, which was the result of a congenital birth defect.
All children are vulnerable, and some are even more vulnerable, and I know for the investigators, definitely, it just created even more of a desire to find out who this little boy was and what had happened to him.
DNA samples are also obtained from a femur bone and submitted to existing DNA databases in the hope they will lead to a breakthrough.
They exhumed the body, and they were able to get DNA out of that to try to search for any sort of match.
At that point, I think everyone expected that the DNA would be a hit.
But investigators hit another dead end, and the case goes cold for a second time.
In order for something to hit or associate genetically to each other, you have to have something to compare it to.
Finding something new to do with a case this old with so few resources or so few tangible leads was next to insurmountable.
Then in 2020, investigators receive a tip-off from an unusual source.
It showed up on Facebook, a drawing of a little boy who was anywhere between 1 and 3, and I just said, oh my gosh, that boy looks like a Williams syndrome baby.
She thought that this child looked very similar with the facial characteristics that her child did, and so she gave the investigators that tip.
I found out that the case was out of Oregon in the county and emailed the police department there and asked if they could pass it along to whoever had this case right now.
The sheriff received the tip and he passed it on to me, said, hey, see what you can do with this. And that's when I started making phone calls.
It was a great piece of information, and they started to look at disabled children in Jackson County throughout that time period.
With this new information, investigators reach out to the Oregon State Police Medical Examiner's office.
I suggested to the investigators that we take the DNA sample that we already had and do a completely innovative DNA technique on it. We were going to attempt genetic genealogy on this case.
A new type of DNA testing was now available to investigators, which was known as phenotyping.
Phenotyping is looking at locations in the genes with that DNA profile to look specifically at the location that determines eye color, the location that expresses skin color.
It's significantly more sophisticated in the characteristics that it pulls. It looks at more genetic markers within that DNA than a DNA sample, say for CODIS, would look at. They look at very specific markers and fewer of them.
The phenotyping results were amazing because it really confirmed a lot of what our investigators had first thought.
When they created the new composite based on those factors, even though it was a very similar picture to the black and white composite that had been constructed, it gave it a much more real feel.
He was of Northern European ancestry, and so he was either very fair or fair in his skin color. He had hazel or brown eyes, which was something we had never known before, so great piece of information. He had dark blonde to light brown hair, so again, information we had never had that now we have. Those might seem insignificant as far as characteristics, but to investigators at this point, that was a huge jump in the investigation because now we could go to that existing illustration and we could put color on it and we could give him even more of an identity.
This new technology opens up the case to the possibilities of forensic genetic genealogy.
Investigative genetic genealogy is really a way to find genetic connections between people.
We have the GED databases, and what they permit us to do is to take the sample of DNA from a victim or the deceased or somebody involved in the crime, run that sample through the genealogy, the GED data, and determine who are the relatives of the child.
That's the way we solve cases on these unidentified cases in Oregon, is we look at the familial connection.
The team enlists the help of C.C. Moore, one of the leading practitioners in this emerging field of DNA genetic genealogy investigation.
Dr. Vance worked very closely with C.C. Moore kind of through this initial process.
When she and I first started talking on some of the other cases that we had worked on, it just struck me how committed she was to these cases. Her commitment to our cases was so apparent.
Sometimes we try to work on a case and the DNA is very challenging. And it looks questionable as to whether we will be able to use investigative genetic genealogy. So I was very concerned that the DNA might be too degraded or too contaminated on this case. But because of whole genome sequencing and our bioinformatics scientists, we were able to do so. And I was so thankful because this was a case that was incredibly compelling to me. And I could tell how much Dr. Vance and the investigators cared about it and really needed to make this identification.
I was very much intrigued to see if anything was going to come of it, but I did not realize to what extent the amount of research that was going to be done was undertaken.
Numerous investigators and detectives have retired without solving this case, so we were cautiously optimistic.
When I first received the match list on this case, it was not very promising. I had around 100 centimorgan top match, which is a good match. It's maybe a second cousin once removed or a third cousin, but I didn't have a lot of supporting matches. Many of the other matches were very distant. And so I was concerned that it was going to be very challenging to identify this little boy.
The investigation team gathered to discuss the findings of C.C. Moore's research. Would the mystery of baby boy Doe's identity finally be solved?
Jackson County officials and investigators, our medical examiner personnel were all there, and Cece was there to provide us the information that she had found. And on page 2 of her report, she gives a theory, and it's in bold and it's in italics.
It was amazing. I could not believe how much information she was able to glean and the things that she was able to find.
I think we all wanted to scroll to page 2 at the very beginning, but she's very methodical about the way she explains things. And when we got to page 2 and we saw that bolded paragraph and then her theory, we were blown away.
She was able to link 4th and 5th generation relatives, and then through birth records, death records, driver's licenses, other historical public documents, was able to narrow down a very small window of people that would have been associated with this child.
I was finally able to narrow it down to 3 sisters that I believed likely one of those was going to be this little boy's mother, but I really couldn't get it any further. And then something very important happened in January 2021, and that is that the owners of GEDmatch made the decision to allow unidentified remains or Jane and John Doe cases to be compared against the entire database, which is about 1.5 million people.
That was the critical piece that we needed. You know, nobody was gonna come up with tips, especially after 58 years.
When that happened, we received a first cousin level match to this little boy.
Investigators now have the breakthrough they have been waiting for all these years.
When that report came out and Cece was telling us that she had found his family, and then her theory about the fact that his name was Stevie Crawford, I was ecstatic.
I don't typically reach out to the matches in these cases, but when somebody so young dies, there are often no records that I am able to access to find that this person ever existed.
We all knew then exactly what everyone's role was at that point. Our investigators need to keep investigating. They need to keep talking to the people that had been involved from the very beginning, and now they had names and phone numbers and addresses of people that may be this little boy's relative.
I reached out to the manager of that profile, who was the wife of the first cousin of this little boy. And she was very interested in helping with this case. She was immediately deeply impacted by it.
Police begin interviewing family members to try and build a picture of what might have happened to Stevie back in 1963.
Both of his parents were deceased when we finally discovered who Stevie Crawford was.
Not being able to interview any people that were involved or knowledgeable of the family at the time leave a lot of holes for conjecture.
She started reaching out to their more immediate family members and asking if there had been a little boy that had disappeared when he was a toddler. And she pretty quickly heard a story about a little disabled boy that had existed and that had lived in Oregon for a very short time and then had disappeared.
One woman actually stated that she remembers Stevie. She remembers playing with him. She remembers holding him. She was the daughter of Stevie's mother's second husband. So they were children together. She was a little older than him. Here's this woman who remembers him, remembers that he was disabled, but loved him dearly. So that's a wonderful human connection that we now have.
Said she came home from school every day and held him and really loved him. That is one thing that really warmed my heart and made me feel a lot better about this whole case, that he was loved.
And then one day, Stevie was there, and one day Stevie wasn't there, and they never talked about it.
His mother and her new husband had moved up to the Pacific Northwest area for a very short time, and that when they came back to their hometown, that they no longer had him with them.
Tell us some more, the police said. Well, one day my mother traveled a lot and she would go to all these places and she would take my brother with her, and she came back and she says, we don't have to worry about Stevie anymore.
And more dramatic information emerges about Stevie's troubled family background.
We know that the mother of this little boy had a very rough childhood in and of herself. She had seen her mother kill her father.
The grandfather had been abusive, and the grandmother said she had killed him in self-defense. Stevie's mother had dealt with this horrible tragedy, and I think that led to her living a very unstable life.
Here's this poor girl who's seen so much trauma and violence in her life. She goes on and has a series of marriages.
She had a lot of children that she ended up not raising herself. Some stayed with their father, some went to other relatives. And so what happened to Stevie is not that surprising when you look at this entire family in context.
With new leads to follow, investigators begin gathering any information they can find about Stevie.
I was told a very specific place where the family thought he could have been born, which was not Oregon. And I was communicating that to the investigators, and then they were immediately taking that information and finding more information.
And lo and behold, they found the name and they found the birth record.
Really, I think detectives put the lid on the case when they found his birth certificate, which really confirmed that he did exist. He was born. His name was Stephen Alexander Crawford, and he was the exact age that we thought he should be.
The birth certificate confirmed everything that Cece Moore had been able to research and find. It tied all of those together, and it made it all one piece.
Investigators now needed to obtain permission to get a DNA sample from one of Stevie's blood relatives to confirm his identity.
Genetically, we need to confirm who this little boy is because interviews can only do so much. We wanted to confirm exactly who he was. So a half-brother emerges from all the family history, and he says, I would be happy to have you collect DNA and do a confirmation test with my DNA compared to this little boy's, because I believe I am his half-brother. And so that was completed. We collected his DNA. Parabon Nanolabs again processed that DNA and did what was considered a kinship inference analysis. So that's again looking at connectedness between the DNA from our little boy and the DNA from this adult man who they think is a half-brother.
With conclusive DNA results from the lab, police could finally confirm the identity of baby boy Doe as Stephen Alexander Crawford.
The results were conclusive. It showed that this man was indeed a half-brother of Stevie Crawford. And that information really just sealed the genetic picture for us.
The press release came into the office and it said, "We broke this cold case from 1963. And I looked at the amazing chain of events that they had gone through.
But questions still remained about the circumstances that led to Stevie Crawford's body being left in Keene Creek Reservoir.
If there's more to the story, we want to know what that is. If there was an accident that took place, if there's a credible history to assign to the death where it could have been a natural circumstance, we want to rule all those things out. And if the worst happened to Stevie, we want to make sure that those people are brought to justice.
Obviously, it's very disturbing that someone didn't take the time to report what had happened and definitely didn't take the time to make sure he had a proper, respectful burial.
Stevie Crawford's remains were found in a very remote location. And one could speculate why that is. Perhaps they didn't want him to be found. Perhaps it was just a beautiful location where a little boy could lay to rest.
Mothers cry. They spend a lifetime crying over their lost child. Not here. We didn't talk about it anymore, says the half-brother. We're not going to have to worry about Stevie anymore, said the mother, and never mentioned it again. There was no crying. There was no wailing and lamenting about the loss of a child. Every mother's worst nightmare. Didn't happen here.
A lot of people don't have the resources to bury their loved one, to get them a marker, that type of thing, and this is not something that necessarily means they didn't care about that individual.
It was common that children with, mental delays, cognitive issues, Down syndrome, other syndromes were institutionalized. And they were taken and just put in homes. And that was just how it went back then.
It's really speculation about what her life is like at that point, but it had to have been very, very hard.
The case of Stevie Crawford affected everyone involved in the investigation.
These cases are all very, very near and dear to my heart. And I want the best for them. I want the best for the families that are missing them. And I want the best for the investigators that have tried so hard to find a resolution for these cases, but we're just not there yet.
It makes me think about the care and how the health was for special needs children back then, and having all the medical advances that we've had to help save these kids that couldn't have been saved back then.
Without the painstaking work of investigators down through the years and the advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy tracing, the identity of Stevie Crawford may have remained known only unto God.
Without forensic investigative genetic genealogy, no way this case could have been solved. No way this child ever would have been identified.
It's heartwarming to know that there are folks out there that will work hard to identify what happened to these nameless victims.
It was such a remarkable sequence of events, even though it took 58 years. Each one of those little pieces, led to where we're at today.
I know that the investigators in this case never gave up. They never stopped wanting to find his identity and provide answers to any family that might be out there. And as it turned out, there was family that loved Stevie and wondered what had happened to him. And so their quest really was very important.
I feel as if we can bring resolution to so many more cases based on the success of this one.
Can there be such a thing as closure in a case like Stevie Crawford's?
It would have been really nice to interview firsthand those folks that were directly involved and, you know, discover what exactly happened. Unfortunately, time has not allowed for that.
I think the word closure is not the way I would describe this case. I think resolution is a better way, because when you talk to families about closure, they always shake their head and they say, no, nothing's closed. I feel now that I can turn a corner. I can start to grieve. I can start to plan. I can start to reflect.
With his identity given back to him, little Stevie Crawford can rest peacefully now, back among his own family.
I believe the family in Louisiana specifically is a great uncle that wants to bring him home and have him repatriated to their family cemetery.
From those family members that knew him, I think he was a sweet little boy. I think he was very lovable, and I think he loved very deeply.
He could have died of natural causes. He was not a healthy little boy, and this family just may not have had the resources to bury him the way he should have, the way we all wish that he had been.
His family members remembered playing with him when he was a tiny boy. The community never forgot about him. So regardless of what may have happened to him, he was never forgotten. Nobody stopped fighting for him. Everybody wanted answers.
It took more than half a century. It took 58 years, but it was worth it.